What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel.
Today, we got to chat with our good friend Jess all about blood sugar and different lifestyle and nutrition strategies you can implement into your life to help you regulate your blood sugar. We go into different things such as hypoglycemia symptoms, different ways to formulate a meal to better regulate your blood sugar, and different signs that might indicate that your blood sugar is dysregulated. So we're hoping that this podcast helps anybody who is dealing with this issue.
Let's get into it. Okay. All right. Hey, Jess, thank you so much for hopping on the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel podcast. I think a good starting place before we dive into some questions about blood sugar regulation is, who is Jessica Ash?
Well, I like to say, I'm a functional nutritionist, but I'm also just a hormone nerd. I just am super interested in how the why behind hormones and how our physiology actually works. And it's kind of been a process from coming from being very, very sick, having PCOS, all types of thyroid issues, autoimmune issues, just a bunch of mystery symptoms. And then going through the process that a lot of us do where, we kind of discover some type of way of eating. We go with it for a while. I discovered paleo. And then, obviously some things get better because you're coming away from a standard American diet, bad habits. And then you kind of progress and you go a little bit deeper, you get more and more restrictive, depending on the person. For me, it was I went from paleo to then keto, then carnivore, and just kind of went stricter and stricter and stricter. And for me, it was always this, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And I knew, and I'm sure a lot of us do, people that are listening, you guys as intelligent people, you continue to question, if this is the answer, why am I feeling this way? And so that really led me to dig deep, understand physiology, understand how the cells worked. And I started to realize oh, wow, this is what we need to be doing to actually support function rather than just suppress symptoms. And that's kind of how my career progressed. But over time, my health progressed as well. And now I actually help women stop focusing so much on their symptoms or their disorders, PCOS being one of them, hypothyroidism, all types of hormonal issues. And I help them try to focus on the actual root cause of the issue, which is how do we support ourselves? How do we create an environment so the body can restore balance and get the tools it needs to really thrive? And I know that sounds like cliche, but it's more about actually giving the body the tools it needs so that it can rebalance and trusting that it can rebalance itself rather than trying to constantly manipulate the body.
Yeah, we definitely had a huge impact on our journey. And considering that you've been through so many of those similar dietary paths and kind of still questioning well, why isn't this working? I was sold that this was the answer and it's still not working. And then also just the struggle of focusing on symptoms, I think, is something that anybody who's gone through a health journey has to overcome, because you can't heal when you're so fixated on what is wrong with me. It just simply doesn't work that way. So I think that was a great intro. And on the topic of being balanced, our topic today is blood sugar. So kind of just want to do a basic intro of why blood sugar is important and what tissues require glucose, all those things. If you could give us the background before we dive into the more specific questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So blood sugar is so important. And I think a lot of people know that. That's why so many health experts focus on it. But I think there's a big misunderstanding of it. And we have this tendency in the health and wellness community to hyper focus on one thing and stop seeing the body as a whole and not actually ask why something is important. We just hyper focus on something and we try to manipulate it with our habits rather than taking a step back and asking our bodies, why is this happening? Why is this imbalance? And then how do we actually provide the body what it needs to restore function? So blood sugar, we need it to survive. Our bloodstream constantly has a steady supply of glucose to fuel our cells. A lot of our cells, and I'm not going to say all cells because that's not true, but a lot of our cells really prefer to take glucose and then use glucose to make ATP in the mitochondria. Now, there are some cells that do prefer free fatty acids, like the muscle cells, for example. And then there are certain cells, a lot of our cells can use both. So they prefer glucose, but they can absolutely use the backup system or take in free fatty acids at the same time. You know, a lot of times you've probably heard the term like metabolic flexibility that gets thrown out a lot. You know, a really healthy body does have metabolic flexibility. It can bounce between glucose and fat depending on what state of activity you're in. Different cells are going to prefer different fuel at different times. And then like the nervous system and the brain, for example, they can only use glucose. It is a very superior source of energy. It's a quick firing type of energy. And so the systems that require a steady state of energy or are high performing often only run on glucose. So blood glucose, you know, we'll often focus on blood glucose being too high. That's often demonized. But if our blood glucose drops too low, we would actually die. So that's like really important to remember is a lot of people are like, oh, well, like high blood glucose or high blood sugar is like so bad. And it's, of course, we don't want our blood sugar swinging either way in either direction, too high or too low. But if we drop too low, we would actually die. And so that's important to remember because so many people focus on the high that they forget what goes low will eventually go high. And the body has a lot of systems in place, a lot of hormones that can actually be manipulated in order to manufacture blood sugar so that even if we're not eating it, we can still make it.
So what is, in your opinion, like a healthy blood sugar pattern look like throughout the day? Because I feel like that's something that is actually different based on what community you're in. There seems to be this like obsession with wanting a flat line. So what do you view as like a healthy blood sugar pattern?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that I've seen like a lot, the continuous glucose monitor is becoming more and more popular. People are trying to do whatever they can, like manipulate their habits to manipulate the line and keep it really flat. But that's actually not a healthy blood glucose pattern. That's actually a really dangerous blood glucose pattern. And that's really fascinating to me because a lot of people are keeping their blood sugar chronically low. So I hate to throw out numbers because a lot of people will say like, okay, they focus on the number and they forget to focus on the habits. So I always say like, if you're going to track your blood glucose, you should be tracking all your other metabolic markers as well. All of, you know, we want to be looking at our body temperature, our pulses, our sleep, our energy, our mood, you know, all of that kind of stuff. We want to be looking at how our body is functioning and then look at the number that our body likes to naturally stick around. Because from what I've seen working with hundreds of women is that the body's going to try to stay at a certain range based on the imbalance that it feels. Oftentimes, people who are under excessive amounts of stress are going to need more blood glucose in the bloodstream because the body wants there to be quick fuel constantly in the bloodstream for those cells to grab. Now, we can talk about insulin resistance later and insulin later, but at the end of the day, a healthy blood glucose level is actually what your body determines when you are healthy. So when you have all those strong metabolic markers, you're balanced, you're going to often find that you stick around a certain range. Like for me, I always stick around 100. And if I drop any lower than 100, I start to feel those symptoms of, okay, I'm not, like I need to eat soon. And so a healthy blood glucose pattern, what it should look like is after you eat a meal, you should see a small spike, not like a huge spike up and then a far drop down. We want a small spike because that's going to signal the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin acts as a key to allow the blood sugar into the cell. And so therefore now the cells are going to take up that glucose. And then you're going to gradually, as the cells take up glucose, you're going to see a steady drop in blood sugar until boom, you start to feel hungry and your body is saying like, hey, I need fuel again. And so you're going to see these gradual ups and then like a slow, steady rise down. You don't want to be spiking up and then quickly crashing to the ground, which often feels like hanger. So hangry, you go from feeling like, oh, I'm kind of hungry to, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry, I need fuel, I can't think straight, I'm so angry, like I can't focus. That shows you that your blood sugar is going up and down in very dramatic dips. I always like to like call it a baseline. You kind of like to stick around this number, but because blood sugar is dynamic, it never stays static and it's not supposed to stay static. We don't want a body that remains stagnant or static. It's going to kind of flow through that line. So this is our line of balance. If we stayed static, we would stay right there. And so you're going to see blood sugar kind of steadily stay through that line. Where we get in trouble is when we start to bounce really far away from that line. And oftentimes people don't realize that their habits are forcing the body to go up, because I always say when blood sugar goes down, whatever goes down must come up, and the body will do that by whatever means necessary.
You bring up a good point. Like, it's natural for your blood sugar to rise after you eat, because your body has to do something with the fuel that you just consumed.
Yes.
If it doesn't manufacture insulin, that's a bad thing, and all that food is just going to be sitting in your body. So like a natural, like an insulin release is a natural process to allow your body to actually use that fuel. So that's like a good thing to happen. But where we see the issues are the huge spikes, but also the like chronically elevated. So I like to think of it as like the area under the curve. If we're staying elevated for long periods of time, that's kind of a sign that we're not using glucose as efficiently.
Wow.
So we'll get into some tips that you have on like ways to regulate it. But what would you say the best way to track and monitor it? Continuous glucose monitor is obviously best, but that's really expensive. And I feel like it can get a little bit tedious having to track that every day. It may add some stress. But what are some signs that someone can easily use, like you said, like body temperature or just like feelings and things like that, where they can track whether their blood sugar is at a good, healthy pattern?
Yeah, so I do like blood sugar monitors. I think they can be helpful tools, but a lot of times we do get obsessed with those numbers, and then we're often actually like practicing habits just to manipulate the numbers, and that's where we can run into like a world of trouble. So there's way more to blood sugar than just what the numbers are saying, and obviously you can't really measure on a tissue level which cells are uptaking glucose and which are not. So a lot of people can have normal numbers and also are experiencing really severe insulin resistance in certain areas of their body. So that's where numbers like can really fail us. So that's why we have to look towards how our body's functioning. And that can be like, I really do like using body temperature. I like using pulses, but to get away from the numbers, it's more like feeling really satisfied after a meal, very content, not sleepy. So you should feel energized. You should be experiencing good digestion. So constipation can actually be a sign of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. Digestive issues just in general, like bloating as well, can be a sign that, okay, something's going on with blood sugar. Brain fog can be a huge sign. Lack of mental clarity, lack of ability to focus, moodiness. So your moods are just going all over the place. You're not feeling content. You're not feeling satisfied. You're not feeling happy. Anxiety and all those feelings along with it. So feeling overwhelmed, feeling triggered, feeling kind of obsessive almost. You want to think of it as like a heightened state of fight or flight. So, you know, if you were being hunted, for example, what are the feelings you would experience? You would be jumpy, you'd be constantly looking over your shoulder, you'd be suspicious. Those are the feelings that you can feel when you have low blood sugar. I'm trying to think of what else I can mention. Oh, depression can be another one, you know, feeling just like a low mood, low energy. That can be a huge sign that you are needing blood sugar. So those are like kind of the main ones that I often see. Oh, and then poor sleep, you know, waking up throughout the night, not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep, feeling, actually having high blood sugar in the morning can be a big sign that you have blood sugar issues. So that kind of waking, or what they call the dawn phenomenon, can be a sign that blood sugar is really messed up the day before, like going up and down.
So obviously your eating habits has a large impact on your blood sugar, but before we dive into that, because I think that's going to be the meat and potatoes of this, what are other factors in your life that could be negatively impacting your blood sugar control?
I mean, a lot of things. Our sleep has a big impact. The type of exercise we're doing and like how we're going into our workouts. So are our workouts fueled properly, or are we like doing fasted, you know, HIIT? There are a lot of different types of exercises, so that can impact blood sugar. Our, you know, just our work environment or just our environment in general. You know, if we hate our job, or we have like a lot of issues with our family or our relationships, or we have a lot of trauma, like just stress in general that we're not dealing with, that's constantly firing the nervous system. That's obviously going to increase your needs for glucose, and then your glucose is going to constantly be dropping. And so really many lifestyle factors can affect blood sugar. Anything that's going to stress your body out, and by stress I just mean like increase the demands for fuel that your body has, can impact your blood sugar, because every time your cells need fuel, and you can think of like your nervous system, for example, like I'll just use a specific example. Like yesterday, if you were just sitting there overthinking for 4 hours about some issue that you had with somebody a week ago, every time you're overthinking that, those neurons are firing and you are using glucose, so things like that we just don't think of, thinking, sleeping, walking, just going through our lives in general require glucose. And so if we're not meeting those demands, blood sugar is going to drop. But remember, if it drops too low, we'll die. So our body's going to say, hey, I'm hungry. And you're going to either eat that sugar or it's going to make that sugar.
Got it. So I think one thing to touch on for the lifestyle factors, there's like a smart way to move your body to help improve blood sugar regulation, and then also your body's ability to utilize glucose. And then, like you mentioned, there's kind of like a taxing and stressful way, which would kind of be like the fasted workouts, the excessive HIIT, the hour-long spin classes. So I think let's touch briefly on like why certain types of like exercise habits can ultimately improve it. So I would say Jess is probably a proponent of like strength training and like regular light walking throughout the day. So I think those are two things that we specifically like to focus on, is strength training and then regularly moving throughout the day, rather than just being like sitting all day, and then just like one little bout of intense exercise at some point in the day.
Right. I know it can feel really good when you like get really sweaty and you work really hard and you feel like you want to puke, or like, afterwards you get that feeling of just like, oh my gosh, like my body is so exhausted. But that's like the adrenaline. And that is oftentimes a state of very like lowered blood sugar. And if those types of workouts are done too often and they're not fueled properly, which I would say like 99% of people are not fueling appropriately unless you're an athlete and you know how to fuel yourself appropriately for workouts like that. What's happening, and I love like Libby Westcombe, she refers to this as like metabolic purgatory. I've heard her refer to that. I've liked that before, where you're not really building anything, because if you're doing like a constant state of HIIT, you're kind of like you're tapping into your glycogen stores using adrenaline. And so adrenaline and cortisol are often going to break down muscle tissue. So you're not actually like building anything. You're more likely like tearing things down. And so it really just taxes your system, your stress system, and it really wreaks havoc on your blood sugar. That's why there are multiple studies that actually show that high intensity interval training increases resistance to insulin, because you're actually, oftentimes women are not fueling themselves appropriately, and so they're having to tap into their backup systems. And when you burn free fatty acids, or you're forcing the body to burn free fatty acids and it's not doing it at its own accord, a lot of times the body actually has to become resistant to insulin so it can turn away the glucose and take in the free fatty acids. And it's often just fuel availability. So if there's not enough glucose to use as fuel, the body's just going to turn to an alternative fuel source. And so what slow strength training does and building muscle tissue does is it actually increases your body's ability to take in free fatty acids. So your other cells are more likely to burn glucose, because when there's too much free fatty acids in the bloodstream, oftentimes the cells cannot burn glucose well, or you'll find the phenomenon of resistance to insulin happening. And so building muscle tissue, which is a very metabolically active tissue, works for your metabolism in the long run. And then just moving your body in general is very healthy. You want to move your lymph system. It's good for detoxification. It's good for your joints. It's good for your ligaments. And it's good for some cardio and recovery as well. A lot of people are super anti-cardio, and just because HIIT training or like high intensity interval training is very taxing on the body, walking at a steady pace or doing breathing drills, that's really good for you. And it's an important part of being active, and it's way better than, like you said, spending all day sedentary and then just like bam, slam your body for an hour and a half and then go back to just sitting all day.
Right. Before we got really into anything health and wellness, we were those people who would sit all day, like during university, and then out at night. I thought that was good.
Powerlifting, yeah.
And at this time, we weren't eating any specific like keto or carnivore either. So I don't even think we recognized that we were becoming just more and more just like insulin resistant.
But I will give us a single pat on the back for understanding one thing, is that like HIIT and spin cycle is not building muscle. It's taxing your body.
Wait, but we did that.
We did it like aggressive. We've had a good mindset on like what's required for muscle building to a degree.
Right.
Number of years. And I think people get confused that like these like what's that class called, like Orange Theory?
Yes.
Like those type of course classes, like they're like, yeah, I'm toning up, and it's like, no, you're actually breaking down your muscle. And in order to build up muscle, that requires like smart exercise and proper fueling, and that muscle building will pay off in the long run because you will improve your blood sugar regulation, because like you said, your muscles can then pull more free fatty acids while you're sitting down. Your muscles will use up free fatty acids in your tissue while you're just resting all day. So that way you can be more insulin sensitive for your other tissues.
Right. And that's why I like to bring up like people who are forcing their body to run on fat most of the time, free fatty acids, they're often not recognizing that if they were to go chug a big gulp, I'll just use that as an example, or even like eat a huge sweet potato, that's why their blood sugar is just going through the roof. And then they're like, oh my gosh, carbs bad, you know? And I'm like, you're doing it to yourself. You're actually taking away your ability to be sensitive or metabolically flexible, so to speak, by forcing your body to constantly run on free fatty acids and then make the glucose that it needs. It's a completely double-edged sword.
That was us. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think exercise is an important topic here, but you said you can't outrun the nutrition piece of it.
Right.
Can we talk about first maybe macronutrient ratios? So like carb to protein ratios, how this affects blood sugar, and then where fat fits into this.
Yeah. So I love to say that like carbs and proteins work together. It's amazing how nature works, but carbs are going to raise blood sugar. They get broken down and they go into the bloodstream and they will raise blood sugar. Whereas protein actually creates more of an insulin response than carbohydrates do. And protein is going to be a macronutrient that lowers blood sugar. So remember that a lot of people think insulin equals bad. And it's interesting because insulin is a blood sugar lowering hormone. So it's interesting for me that people who are obsessed with lowering their blood sugar demonize the hormone that lowers blood sugar. Like, I'm just like, you know, that meme that's just like all the calculations, and I'm just like, I don't understand. So it's really about creating balance in the body. And like I said, I like to remind people constantly that blood sugar is a dynamic thing. It's never going to remain stable. You could try like all your might to keep it stable, and you're just going to actually hurt yourself because it's supposed to be dynamic. And when you eat protein and carbs together, you know, protein's going to lower blood sugar and carbs are going to raise it to kind of bring you more to that stability point. And everyone's ratios need to be different. So some people require a little bit more protein. Some people actually have a high need for carbohydrates. I've seen people upwards of the ratio of like 1 to 4, meaning you need 1 gram of protein to 4 grams of carbohydrates in one sitting. But it's usually like 1 to 2, 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 1 for people who are not very insulin sensitive or can't handle a lot of carbs. But it's so important when we eat carbohydrates to eat protein with them. And it's so important when we eat protein to eat carbohydrates with them, because I see this a lot. Women are doing a lot of women don't eat enough protein, but the women who are maybe obsessed with low carb dieting are eating tons of protein, tons of fat. That meal instantly drops their blood sugar. So all they can dream about is like keto desserts. You know what I mean? Like right after they eat, they're like, why am I craving sugar? Or like they just go straight for the nut butter, you know, like peanut butter, you know, or they just like, all they can think about is like, okay, like on Pinterest, like, okay, I'm going to make this dessert with swerve, you know? It's like, that's why you have your body's trying to get your blood sugar up, but in your mind's so powerful that you've told yourself the only carbs you can consume or sweet things you can consume are low carb. But your body's being really wise and trying to get your blood sugar back up so it doesn't have to eat itself in order to get that blood sugar up, because that's what it's going to do. You're going to eat yourself to make sugar.
It's really funny, the example you provided, because I was just going through our Pinterest. This is something we haven't touched in like 2 years. And it was just like low carb sweets, low carb desserts, low carb breakfast. And it's like all of these, like using, I don't even know, what are the sweeteners? Stevia and monk fruit.
Yes.
And using cauliflower and it's like, oh,
almond flour. Yeah.
Yeah. You're so right. Like you just become fixated on this, and it's different because like I'm self-proclaimed foodie. I love thinking of recipes and stuff, but it's different when you're thinking of it in terms of like you're still coming at it in a very restrictive mindset, and you have to wonder like why is your body like why mentally are you seeking out these things like these replacements and these like it's basically the fake version of the food. Why? What is stopping you truly from enjoying like the real food version?
Right.
It's tricky.
Well, I honestly think Jess was one of the people that helped us make that realization, in that like sugar addiction is like a sign, or not sugar cravings are literally a sign from your body that it needs more glucose. And
cravings of all sorts are messages.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But Jess brings up a lot that like when you don't consume carbs in a meal, your blood sugar is going to drop, and so therefore you have to raise these other like fight or flight responses to generate and produce the glucose that your body needs. So it makes sense that your body's like crying, carbs, please.
Yeah. I think so. A lot of our audience might be like either carnivore or post-carnivore from before. But I think like to explain why we were able to live in this state for so long is like, one, we are really like determined. So we are like, once we like stick to something, like we don't really stray from it. It's kind of like the life we create. And then two, we're like really good at ignoring our bodily cues. Like that's just the state that we get into, and we don't recognize these things because unless you come across Jessica Ash Wellness, how are you supposed to know, right?
Right. And it's interesting that like the types of women that are attracted to the style of eating are often these like very type A individuals. A lot of them, like I work with a lot of them, and a lot of them have experienced a lot of like trauma in their lifetime, or they're just those type A, which is trauma in itself. Like just go at all costs. Like doesn't matter what your body is saying, like you're gonna make it happen, even if you have to chug a gallon of coffee, and that is an out-of-body experience. You have to separate yourself from your body in order to be able to function in that state. So a lot of the women that are going carnivore or keto, they're already so separated from their body, they don't even care. And then they have outward sources telling them that like, no hunger, you're doing awesome, or like all of the bodily cues that something's wrong is just like, you need to try harder. Like, you got a sugar craving, like you got to go lower carb. I remember like I had a keto coach. Yeah. I had someone tell me to eat like 10 grams, like go from 20 grams of carbs to 10 grams of carbs because I was craving carbs, and I was like, oh, okay, like I can do it, like we can do it. And that's part of the problem.
So, okay, just to recap. So I think it's important to know that, like you said, if you eat carbs alone, you're going to get a huge blood sugar spike. Not good. If you eat protein alone, your blood sugar is going to drop.
Yeah.
So it's important to have them together, combine them. And you brought up some potential carb to protein ratios for someone to experiment with. If you're switching from a low carb to more pro-metabolic approach, you may have to start at more of a 1-to-1, meaning if you have like 30 grams of protein in a meal, consume like 30 grams of carbs.
Yeah.
And I would say right now I feel pretty good at a 2-to-1. So if I'm doing 30 grams of protein at a meal, I'll do 60 grams of carbohydrates.
Yep.
Well, question: what are some signs that you are doing well at your given carb to protein ratio?
Yeah, so I think like that's more of just some experimentation. Like when you first start, especially if you're coming from like really low carb, you might actually have to like be very low carb, or still what I would consider low carb for a while, because as your body learns to tolerate carbs again, it's going to take time. And if you go too fast, like your body just will not use that fuel and you'll just push it into the fat stores. And the biggest sign would be like just rapid weight gain. But if you're paying attention, oftentimes after a meal, the biggest sign that you need more carbs is you just immediately crave carbs. Like a lot of times people will crave something sweet afterwards that only like drinking some orange juice will quench, or having like, they almost are craving like that candy type sweet, or they just like don't feel completely satisfied with their meal. I like to remind people that there's a difference between fullness, like the feeling of being physically full and stuffed to the brim, and actually being satisfied, where you're like, like that meal really like hit the spot, you know, you're content, and then you feel really balanced for the 3 to 4 hours after you ate that meal. Because if you're getting like hungry right away, or you get sugar cravings an hour after, that meal didn't really meet your needs. And like we had talked about, like all cravings have meanings. I love, like, Dr. Pete really like hammered it home for me when he said, like, somebody asked him, where do you start with all this? And he's like, well, I think it's a good idea to start with your cravings, because you don't want to like break your own body down, you know? So it's like his mindset is like, your body's craving that, so it doesn't have to compensate or break itself down. And so that's a good place to start. So if you're experiencing cravings, or you're tired, or maybe you're not even like staying full or satisfied for 3 to 4 hours, it might be a good idea to experiment with that carb to protein ratio. And some people just like don't even know about it. So when you start to pay attention, you'll start to find like, oh, I'm feeling a lot better with a little more carbs.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, so where would fat fit into this?
Yeah, so fat is really important macronutrient because we build hormones from it. It creates cell stability, so the cells actually kind of use it as a barrier around itself. And so the types of fat and quality fats that we can, that quality of fats we consume, really determines the flexibility and the health of the overall cell. And also we need it to make hormones. It also provides us with fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A and D and K, and even E. And we want those nutrients for fertility, for metabolic health, for liver health, for so many things. And that's really the purpose of fat. It also can provide some satiation. But when you eat, your body really only likes to burn glucose or fat. And when you're digesting both at one time, especially if you're doing a lot of fat and a lot of carbohydrate, the fat always wins. And that's where people have problems. You know, people will say like the standard, this is where a lot of the science comes from with carbs being bad. A lot of the research is actually being done with like a high carb and then like a high fat, especially like a high PUFA diet. They're adding like canola oil or soybean oil to the experiment. And so they're creating insulin resistance by feeding someone carbohydrate and then like a good amount of PUFA oils as well. And so the insulin resistance often comes from like a high fat, high carb diet. And so we want to be eating enough fat that our hormones are good, that we're getting enough fat soluble vitamins, and that we're feeling really satiated, and like our tissues are feeling lubricated. Like we're not feeling too dry, our hair's not super dry and brittle, but we don't want to be consuming so much fat that it's preventing our body from using carbohydrates. And so that's going to be different for everyone. And I hate to give numbers, but it's going to be anywhere from like 30 to 50% fat. But if you're going to increase your fat, then your carbs need to go down. And most people are going to find that they actually need more carbs to thrive, especially women. And so that means if your carbs are going to go up, your fats are probably going to need to go down a little bit. But there's a balance, and too much of one or too much of the other can be problematic.
So were you saying, sorry, no, you're fine. More questions. Were you saying 30 to 50% of like your total caloric intake?
Calorie, yes.
And then, so I guess in terms of like playing around with that number, would you say that this is a tricky question, I think, because in times of stress for females, hormonal health kind of can go down the tube, the toilet.
Yes.
Along the same lines, we might require more glucose.
Yes.
So at that point, you know, say we're really stressed out and we're noticing these hormonal effects. So we're thinking, okay, maybe I need to raise my fats. But at the same time, your body is craving these carbs. What would you suggest for somebody to do there?
I would say that carbs are going to be the priority there, just because if our nervous system is under stress and we're craving carbs, then we need more carbs. And oftentimes the fat's not going to be the quick fuel that we need. You know, over time, if we've caused our nervous system so much stress over time, then fats might help, but it really also depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from a super high fat diet, you're going to have to slowly want to get to a point where you're eating less fat and more carbohydrate. And that might take time, but it's really important for hormonal health to get carbs in. And then the time of our cycle actually matters, because when our estrogen is high, we tend to, or estrogen is elevating like before we ovulate, we often burn carbs a little bit better. But then after, when we have progesterone, we're often burning a little bit more fat. So you might find that like the first half of your cycle, you crave a little bit differently than in the second half of your cycle. And for some women, it's vice versa, because progesterone does increase your overall thyroid output. So you might just need more of both, more calories in general.
Okay, so I think it's also important to point out that fat also has like a blood sugar spike, a blunting effect on blood sugar spikes. So
Yes.
I personally, like when I have like starchier carbs like potatoes, adding some butter to that meal, I feel a lot more satiated and a lot more like mood stabilized afterwards. I've got my little slopes, you know, not my spikes and crashes. But like you brought up, substrate competition can be an issue. And this is one of the things that Georgie brought to my attention when I was talking to him on some of our interviews, that he pointed to, that a lot of the research studies like anti-sugar, anti-carbs are the standard American diet, where sugar is added on top of this high carb and high fat diet. So just to provide, I feel like people like an example, they like numbers. So I'm just going to provide an example for people. A meal where I know that I feel good at and I've experimented with is like 30 grams of protein, 60 to 65 grams of carbs, and then 15 to 20 grams of fat. I've personally found that that's like a really satiating, I feel good. I don't have like thirst issues or cravings afterwards. So that could be a starting point for someone, but everyone is different, and like tweak with those ratios to find what works for you. And that can differ every single day based on your stress, your activity level. So it's never going to be stagnant. There's no one set of rules. You really do have to do some experimenting.
I think that's an incredible example. And I find that that's usually around the range. You know, that's usually like a good 30% of your calories are coming from protein, about 50% are coming from carbs, and about 30-ish%, 25 to 30% are coming from fat. And that's usually around the area that people feel best. That's where I feel best. You know, if I pushed it to like 3 egg yolks cooked in butter and like extra butter on the toast and all this stuff, I would start to feel a little bit more sluggish after a meal, because that would be more like 30 to 35 grams of fat. Does that mean fat is bad? No, but you might just need to cook with a little less butter. And I think that was an excellent example.
Yeah. Would you mind touching on, you bring this up a lot, would you mind touching on the importance of minerals in blood sugar regulation?
Yeah, so minerals are huge, and I always like to take it back to the beginning. So people often pinpoint the time that they started having symptoms as the time their problems started, but you need to rewind probably 5 to 10 years before that. And that's where a lot of people are like, well, keto or low carb or carnivore is working so well for me, or it works well for a period of time, but they're already often coming into these diets with different depletions in certain minerals, just from the stress of life, depending on where we're coming from. I mean, some of us are born with mineral deficiencies because our moms were super deficient. So it just really depends on our history, but we have to just assume that we're already going into these lifestyles pretty minerally depleted. We're not eating super nutrient dense diets, we're stressed. And oftentimes that's going to be our electrolytes like sodium and potassium, our trace minerals, things like selenium and zinc, and then are those other electrolytes like calcium and magnesium. And then the fat soluble vitamins come in and play a role and help us regulate those minerals. And so oftentimes, because we're not eating these nutrient dense diets, we're minerally depleted. And that's why we're already experiencing hormone issues or insulin resistance, or just an inability to stabilize our blood sugar, because we cannot separate our adrenal glands or our thyroid from our blood sugar regulation. They are all one and the same. The hormone systems exist to manipulate our blood sugar, because that's how our body fuels the cells. And so our brain is taking in constant information of our environment and then telling our hormone systems or our glands how to manipulate resources. And then the liver is playing a role there too, to constantly keep this place of homeostasis. But once we start to experience symptoms, that's when homeostasis can no longer be kept. The body is now running out of resources. It's tried to compensate for so long, and it can no longer compensate. And now things are starting to fall through the cracks because the body just doesn't have the resources. And when I say resources, I'm normally talking minerals. So magnesium is going to play a huge role in how the blood sugar responds to, or how the cell responds to the blood sugar, and responds to hormones in general, like insulin. Sodium and potassium are going to play a huge role in how our cells respond to hormones like thyroid hormone, which completely have a huge impact on our blood sugar. And so I would say that focusing in on minerals is more important than focusing on like a restrictive diet, because most of us are so minerally depleted that focusing in on like sodium and potassium and magnesium and our trace minerals is going to get us more of a long-term sustainable effect on balancing our blood sugar and getting our insulin response under control than something like a keto diet or like low carb eating.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of things that negatively affect blood sugar, like you were saying, minerals, where do we just touched on fats, but now getting more into the specific fats, what are the effects seen in the research of like PUFAs on blood sugar, or things like alcohol, any kind of like toxin substance?
Yeah, so we can't talk about this without talking about the liver. And the liver is kind of, a lot of people just think of it as like a filter, or it's just like, the liver just, filters our toxins and kind of separate it from the metabolism. But at the end of the day, the liver is kind of the battery pack of the body. That's why it's such a nutrient dense source in the animal. I mean, all the organs are, but the liver specifically, because that is the storage tank for nutrients. And the liver really gets to determine what cells get nutrients. And also it plays a huge role in storing up a lot of glycogen to keep blood sugar stable for when we're not eating. And so, when we do not have a healthy liver, that can really play an overall role in our inability to manage our blood sugar. And so starting with the liver, it's very important that it's supported. And then when we flip over to things like fats, like the types of fats we're eating, or alcohol, for example, or just toxins in general, like xenoestrogens, the toxins that we find in like chemicals, even like what you guys have been experiencing with biotoxins, all of these substances are often fairly estrogenic and fairly stressful for the liver and the overall system as a whole. And so the liver is taking the main brunt of that weight. The liver doesn't actually filter anything. It's breaking down in different phases. It's almost like this constant chemistry lab where it's taking one thing, breaking it down into something else, moving it into the next phase, packaging it up so it can be carried out of the body as waste. And the more that the liver has to do in regards to these toxins or these estrogenic substances, the less it can do for our metabolism. And then, looking at the research in regards to the types of fats we're consuming, like certain fats like canola oil or soybean oil, they're really just products of the Industrial Revolution. We could think of them as toxins. They are technically fats, but they're more than that. They're not really natural in the sense that the body doesn't process them like a true fat, and a true fat comes from an animal. So like butter, lard, ghee, all those things actually have those fat soluble vitamins that we talked about, and they create way better cell structure. But the body will take whatever it gets. And so if the majority of our diet is PUFAs, we're going to have unhealthy cells. They're going to use those fats to kind of, create the cells that don't really have a lot of stability. And it's also going to really tax all of our organ systems, but specifically the liver, which is going to have an impact on how the cells uptake blood sugar and also just react to all hormones, including insulin.
Isn't it true that excessive PUFA intake blocks pyruvate dehydrogenase, which then can negatively impact your body's ability to fully oxidize glucose, to go through that full oxidation cycle? So then as a result, you could potentially have prolonged elevated blood sugar?
Yes. Yeah. And this is where like a lot of people talk about like the metabolic end products. They're like, oh, well, what about XYZ? Like these problematic metabolic end products when you're burning glucose or burning sugar. And in reality, it's not just like burning sugar equals this. It's actually a malfunction of the cells. And you can even see this in like all research regarding things like cancer or diabetes. It's that you can almost, I like to like simplify it and say like, when you spin a top, it should spin normally. But if you tap that top, it's going to start wobbling and it could start hitting things and causing all types of problems that it's not from the top spinning. The top spinning is not the problem. It's the fact that it got bumped or that it's running into things that's now the problem. And so these metabolic end products, or, saying like sugar equals XYZ thing, that's not true. It's that there's now things outside things like PUFAs and toxins affecting how we're oxidizing sugar, and it's causing this oxidation to kind of spin out of control.
Yeah, but I don't like to create fear like amongst like whole food PUFA intake, but it is something that we have personally decided to try to minimize where we can, because we are choosing to consume a lot of carbohydrates, and so we want to make sure that our glucose oxidation is running on like good speed. But along the same lines of like lifestyle nutrition factors that can potentially negatively affect blood sugar, like we said, potentially alcohol, PUFAs, and you brought this up earlier, but can you briefly chat on some of the consequences of overdoing fasting? So kind of the approach in the pro-metabolic community is eating every 3 to 4 hours so that we can help support our blood sugar, provide our body the tools that it needs so it doesn't have to manufacture its own glucose. Can you talk a little bit about what will happen if you fast excessively with our blood sugar regulation, and what are the potential consequences of that?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned before that the liver is kind of the first line of defense. So the liver can store about 130 grams of stored glycogen, and glycogen is just backup glucose. So at any time, the liver can turn glycogen into glucose and release it into the bloodstream so that our cells have constant stream. 130 grams of glycogen equals about 8 hours. Interesting that we sleep about 8 hours, right? So a healthy liver can store about 8 hours of glucose. And then, you know, our muscles, depending on the amount of muscle tissue we have, we do have glycogen stored in our muscles. Now, there are a lot of things that affect how we can tap into glycogen. And if you're not regularly filling your muscles up with glycogen, they're not going to have readily available glycogen. So that's important to remember. A lot of people are like, well, your liver or your muscles have like 430 grams of carbs in them. Well, if you're regularly filling them up. But the problem is when we excessively fast, and we fast, a lot of times people who are fasting are like, they're eating at 5 p.m., that's their last meal of the day, and they're not eating, they're casually like not eating until 10 a.m. the next day. That's a pretty long fast. And then most of the time during the day, they're not actually replenishing all their glycogen stores. They're not eating that 3 to 4 hour pattern to replenish the glycogen in their muscles and replenish the glycogen in your liver. And so you could think of it as like, simplifying it, it's like emptying a cup and then not filling the cup all the way back up, and then emptying the cup a little more, not filling it back up, empty the cup some more. Eventually, you're going to empty the cup faster than you're filling the cup up. And then eventually the cup's just going to be empty. And so you have to constantly fill the cup up to have anything in the cup. And this is where people long term, it takes a while to get those glycogen stores down. But the longer you go and the more common or the more consistent your fasting is, the faster you're depleting your liver glycogen stores and your muscle glycogen stores. And I see this all the time with women who are coming from like keto or low carb or carnivore, or just who are just burned out in general and not eating regularly. They've gotten themselves to a point where they cannot actually fill their liver up, because every time they eat, they're using that blood sugar right away. And so it can take time to actually get the glycogen stores filled back up. It can sometimes take 6 months to a year, because your body's under so much stress, your nervous system is under so much stress that you're constantly, every time you eat, it's just being used right away. Or your body feels so unsafe that it's being pushed into the fat stores. And so this is really where it becomes tricky. Is the problem with fasting constantly is that your liver is now struggling to store glycogen. And when your liver's not full of glycogen, you're not actually making good thyroid conversion. So you're not converting thyroid hormone very well. You're not storing up nutrients appropriately or properly, and you're not detoxing properly. That's the funniest thing to me out of all of it, is people will say like, fast for detoxification. And I'm like, a fueled liver is going to be the most detoxifying thing you can have. If your liver is constantly being emptied of its glycogen stores, then you've got a problem with detoxification. And if you're following a healthy pattern of eating, you're going to almost completely empty your liver of glycogen every night, right? It's going to go about 8 hours. And then right when you wake up, you're going to eat and you're going to start replenishing your glycogen stores for the day. But the problem is people are rolling over in this constant depletion or deficit until they get to a point where they just hit a wall and they're so depleted they have a hard time filling their liver up. And this is where the hypoglycemia really starts to come into play. And so this idea of eating every 3 to 4 hours is not necessarily that you have to do that super long term, but if you've gotten to such a point where you're burnt out, which I'm assuming most people have when they reach my work or your work, it can take some time of really consistently providing the body fuel and enough to put actually back into the glycogen stores and back into the liver. And that can sometimes look like eating every 3 to 4 hours for a couple of years until your body can sustain like 5 hours or 6 hours.
Yeah, I think that just from our own experience and from coming from a lot of fasting and keto and carnivore, our livers were not primed to store glucose. And we've seen a lot of this as we've increased our carbohydrate intake, and then also going through these stressful periods with our house renovations and the mold. Like you were saying, stress can make it harder for your liver, and it's also having to focus on detoxing. And if you're increasing your toxin load, it's just like you're spinning your wheels at a certain point.
Yeah.
And so one of the largest things impacted, and this is a huge negative spiral because it's also negatively impacts blood sugar, is your sleep. And so I think one of the most common questions that we get, and then also that we're still trying to figure out, if we're being completely honest, is despite eating, carbohydrate, fat, and or protein before bedtime, so having that nighttime snack, why are so many people still waking up in the middle of the night?
Yeah. So there's a difference between, and oftentimes you'll see this when the liver has a big load. In traditional Chinese medicine, they'll say like the liver time is around 2 a.m. And I would tend to agree that's right around the time where even like an unhealthy liver often starts to run out of sugar. And so people start to wake up around like midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and they like don't sleep well for the rest of the morning, I should say, or the evening. And there are nutrients involved in storing glycogen. So when you constantly deplete your glycogen stores, everything comes at a nutrient cost. I always like to say like everything's a payoff or a trade-off. So if you're going to fast, you're going to trade choline and vitamin A and taurine to like make that trade-off. And over time, you're trading so much of those nutrients that now you just are deficient in those nutrients. And so those are 3 nutrients that I like to bring awareness to is choline, taurine, and vitamin A, specifically retinol or whole foods retinol, whole foods vitamin A. Those are very important nutrients for storing sugar and glycogen in the liver. And oftentimes people who are coming from a very fasted type or like low carb state or just a stressed out state are very low in those nutrients. And so they're having a really hard time maintaining blood sugar, at least from a liver perspective. And so I always say that taurine is very helpful. Another thing to remember is that the nervous system plays a big role. So if the nervous system is constantly firing all night long, then your need for glucose will heighten, but also like your need for B vitamins is another big one that I see. And obviously the liver uses B vitamins as well, but the nervous system specifically. And so getting enough B vitamins during the day, as well as taurine, choline, and vitamin A can be particularly important. And that can just be in the form of diet. Some people actually need to supplement some taurine and find a lot of benefit from supplementing it, at least a little bit, to kind of keep some glycogen in the liver. Inositol, which is technically like a B vitamin, vitamin B8, can be very effective for helping with the liver storage of glycogen as well. So sometimes it's just that you are using more nutrients than you're intaking, and nutrients, it's always a nutrient payoff. A lot of times that's the cost. And so those are important nutrients to kind of check in with. If you're doing a bedtime snack and you're eating enough throughout the day and you're like, I'm doing all of the things, that can be really helpful. I also like to put some magnesium on the liver, like some magnesium lotion or magnesium oil directly on the liver to kind of help it like sink in to the liver. And that can be helpful as well, because sometimes you can supplement magnesium, but is it making it to the liver or being used for other tissues? It's hard to say. So that can be a helpful way to kind of like get some magnesium in the liver for the evening.
So I think a good like summary of this is your liver like has skill sets and you have to support it so it can improve.
Yeah.
You have to work on your liver health, because many of us have done a number of things to just like absolutely destroy it and wreck it. And so like you said, we're kind of in this deficit. And one of the most frequent questions that we receive when we posted this Instagram story is like, do we have to eat every 3 to 4 hours for the rest of our life? And I think a good point that people miss is eating every 3 to 4 hours just is helping us dig ourselves out of that poor liver health hole. And eventually over time, one can get to a place where you have a really, your liver is really skilled. It can hold on, it can store glycogen so you can last a little bit longer, and you can sleep throughout the entire night. When you have supported your liver with proper amount of nutrients, like you said, and the proper amount of like food, I think just like general calorie intake is also important, and eating more throughout the day.
Well, in terms of the specific nutrients you mentioned, there's that old saying, like supports like. And so it just so happens that beef liver is high in choline, vitamin A, B vitamins.
But we eat liver every single day.
I know, but I think that it goes to show that, you know, like there's years of damage to undo.
And we are being constantly exposed to these biotoxins, unfortunately, which makes it hard for the liver because it's so focused on detoxification that it can't necessarily improve its skill set of glycogen storage. But
that applies to, you know, everybody who's going through this, because they don't realize, you know, the stress that you were saying. If you're just sitting and thinking about a stressful conversation for 4 hours, you just depleted yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people really need to start looking like at every aspect of their life of what is causing the stress. It's not just going to be the environment. It's not going to be just your exercise. Like a lot of times it's what's going through your mind. It's focusing on the symptom, which is so hard because you're trying to figure it out. So gosh, it really is a holistic approach to just like even thinking about blood sugar or your liver or really anything. Of course.
And even these emotions like fear or I think a lot of times when we're in a healing journey or we're experiencing symptoms, the root comes down to this fear that we're never going to feel better. So that's our constant fear. It's behind all of it is, when am I going to be done with this? Or even deeper, I don't know if I'm ever going to be done with it. And that fear attracts iron, that fear attracts heavy metals, that fear attracts toxins to it. And it often will do that in a very physical way. So our fascia will get tight, you know, our neck, our shoulders, will start to feel really tight and tense. Maybe we're really sore after a workout, we're not recovering well, which shows that our fascia is really tight. And that fascia is going to hold on to all those toxins, all that iron, all those heavy metals. And so when you actually work on releasing that fascia, you're going to, or releasing those emotions that can sometimes release the fascia as well, all that stuff will finally release and your body can deal with it. So oftentimes if we're holding on to that fear, you can think of it on a physical level, we're holding on to all this junk that we're actually trying with all of our habits to get rid of, but that fear is holding us back. And so sometimes it's not about like all the things we can do, it's actually like, what can we get rid of so our body can, like, we can clear the way for our body to do what it needs to do. And that's why healing is so hard. It's not, you know, we're so used to in our microwave culture of like, do XYZ thing, feel better, you know? And so that's why we're so obsessed with these symptom suppressing type diets, because it's like, we want those immediate results, but healing is often really uncomfortable. And it feels really, it's very like painful. We don't want, and our nervous system is constantly telling us like, oh, shy away from that pain. Like, go this way, do this route. And sometimes the only way that healing can happen is we actually have to lean into the pain, and we have to remind our nervous system, like, it's okay, you're not going to die, you're good, like everything's good, it's going to be okay. And even though it's uncomfortable now, it's not going to be uncomfortable forever. And sometimes that's where the most healing can happen. I don't know why I said that tangent, but I find a lot of people are just so obsessed with like all the things they can be doing that they're actually trying to avoid what they need to be doing.
That is very powerful. I fall into that group. So I am one of those people who really struggles to let go and let my body heal because I'm fixated on what's wrong with me. And I think this is something that Morley Robbins talks about a lot, is there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are you're coming into balance. You love being in balance.
Yeah, that's what he tells us. You should constantly tell yourself, I love to be in balance. I love to be in balance. I love to be in balance.
And
yeah,
I mean, it is very hard. I think, like you said, that's the hardest part of healing.
And I think that that's why many people try out the pro-metabolic approach
they
and
get worse.
They get worse and they're like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I got to quit.
Yep.
But sometimes you've got to take a step backwards in order to take a few steps forward. And healing is really hard.
It is. Yeah. And I think that's like the most important thing for us. As you know, we all have some type of platform to remind people like healing is hard, and it's not going to be like, it's not this destination. Like, it's not like, oh, I've made it. You know, we're not regular Instagram influencers where we're like, look at our amazing life and like everything's dandy, you know, because that's not actually real. And healing is often uncomfortable. It's often layers. It's often happening throughout our whole life. We're really like, healing is also a journey, and that's how we grow. So you can think of it as just growing. So I know it's really hard, especially for people who are coming from these diets that they thought were the answer, and now they're like, oh, it's not the answer. Like, oh shoot, I caused more issues. Like, what? And just remind yourself, like, it's a part of your growth and it's a part of your journey. And now, like, it's time to start actually taking some steps towards healing. And it might not be easy, but it will be worth it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have one more thing I wanted to ask, Jess.
Whatever.
Okay. So one thing that we didn't touch on in terms of like blood sugar regulation with like choosing your meal, like formulating your meal, is I think there's a lot of confusion about this out there, is like fructose and like heavy glucose sources. So as an example, like fruits, orange juice, honey, maple syrup, and then like potatoes, white rice, sourdough bread. What is your best tip for someone with choosing what carbohydrate sources to include in a meal to help them regulate their blood sugar and avoid big spikes? Besides eating carbs and protein together.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So of course it like depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from very low carb, I would just start with like small amounts of things, like almost like small bites, like just being very conscious of like not overloading your system just so you feel fine. Because a lot of people will like start heavy, which is fine, but you're not going to feel super great at first. And then once you've kind of worked up, like, and I would start with like very gentle carbs, like squashes, maybe some like honey, things that don't require like cooked fruits, like just things that don't require a ton of digestion, are very easy to absorb, and that you can kind of limit the amount. Once you've actually gotten up to eating carbs, those gentler carbs comfortably at every meal, at that point, then you want to start combining some carbs to see like what works well. And I've actually been leaning more towards talking about carbohydrates in the form of density and not just as fructose and glucose. Because some people are like saying, well, I'm combining like orange juice and white rice and I feel like crap. Why? And it's like, those are both really light carbs. So there's not really a lot of density there, and they're going to digest very rapidly all at once. And unless you have incredible insulin sensitivity, that blood sugar is just going to spike up, and then your body's not going to know what the heck to do with all that sugar, unless you're like pre-workout. It's like pre-workout or something. So it's important to figure out what type of density you need with carbohydrates. And this is where like oftentimes the fruit carbs are a lot lighter. So like fruit and orange juice and honey, those are really light carbs. They're not going to feel like a lot in your stomach. They're going to digest very rapidly, and they're going to give you quick glucose, which can be good in certain cases. But then something like potatoes or grains or sourdough, rice, those are things, or like root vegetables, squashes, those are going to feel a little denser. They're going to feel different in your stomach. They're going to be a lot more grounding. And so I always say like combine your carbs so that you can create a little bit of a denser meal. So take like a piece of squash and then have some juice on the side, or like have some fruit with potato, because potato is going to digest a little bit quicker like white rice does. And so it's a good idea to combine your fructose and your starches for sure, but also keep meal density in mind, because if you're doing two really light foods and you feel like you're not really satiated, or you feel really tired after a meal, or you just don't feel quite right after a meal, it could just be that the density is not quite there and you need a little bit of a denser carb to carry up, like ground the lighter things in your meal.
I think that's a great point. But one thing, like, so when we made the transition, I really couldn't tolerate starches that well. Like I would get really bad constipation from potatoes and rice and things like that. And then after our biotoxin exposure and our mold exposure, I noticed constipation with that as well. But as I've worked on it, I have really found that combining those two sources, my glucose, the glucose sources that I consider are a little bit more dense. But I think as I've improved my metabolism, my thyroid, and ultimately my digestive health, I've been able to tolerate those better. And I really feel more satiated. Like there's a huge difference between a meal of like steak, potatoes, orange juice, and butter versus like a smoothie with collagen powder.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a good point that you made about the digestion, because a lot of us, if you're coming from a place of imbalance, like you're going to have digestive problems. There's just no doubt about it. Like your nervous system, your thyroid, your hormones are going to affect your digestive system. And so the bacteria balance, everything, also the nutrient density of your food. You know, if you've been going a long time with a low nutrient diet, not getting the right minerals or fat soluble vitamins, your gut's going to be slightly erect, and your body's ability to keep bacteria in balance is also going to be a little bit off. And so a lot of people are going to have like either small amounts of bacterial overgrowth or larger amounts like SIBO, or they're going to have candida, like other fungus issues, or SIFO, which is like fungus growing in the small intestine. These are things that a lot of people will hyper focus on, and they're like, I got to fix these issues before I implement these foods. But actually those foods are going to actually help you overcome those issues. You've just got to do it kind of strategically and a little bit slower, like you did. A lot of people can't digest the hard starches at first just because of those bacterial issues, and they do tend to feed bacteria fairly easily. So sometimes you do have to focus on the lighter stuff like squashes and melons and fruit and things like that. But if you can find some type of starch that you can tolerate, keep that in your diet regularly to kind of ground things, or maybe just do like a bite or two of a starch.
That's what I did. I slowly added it back in after a period of like feeling like I can poop every day, and I felt good with digestion. But
yeah, super important.
So in terms of carb density and like starch versus fructose, what would you say for somebody who is hypoglycemic and, you know, they're doing their best to eat every 3 to 4 hours? Maybe they should be even eating every 2 to 3 hours. I've seen some people suggest that. Should they focus on those more grounding carbs, or should they use those quicker sources?
I think that they should just, I do think they should do denser carbohydrates. They often do better with them. Now there's always an exception to every rule. You know, some people are like, but I do better this way. And if you do that, then of course, keep doing what works for you. But a lot of times they just need to be focusing on denser meals in general. So like less liquid meals, less light meals. Like I would say like yogurt and fruit is a really light meal, or cottage cheese and fruit. Like that might be an okay snack for you, maybe, but if you're hypoglycemic, you're probably going to have to eat more like meat and potatoes with a little bit of juice every couple of hours. And that's annoying. I get it. But it can really help you overcome that, so you can move on to having a little bit more variety. I know like Dr. Katharina Dalton, she's the one that really she's the one that actually acknowledged PMS in the medical field, but she actually helped treat women's fertility issues and their progesterone issues and their cycle issues by simply having them, she calls it the 3-hour starch diet. So she recommended that they, from the minute that they wake up, they have some starch with like other foods too, like protein, carb, and fat, but specifically having starch at every meal every 3 hours really helped keep everything stable and help the cells be able to react to hormones better and not have constant high adrenaline, because anytime adrenaline is high, the body is responding to adrenaline over any other hormone. And that's very much a problem for women, because if there's adrenaline, our blood sugar control is very poor.
What was her name?
Dr. Katharina Dalton, and she wrote a book called The PMS Bible.
Yeah, I've heard Jess bring that up before. But I do think it's important that some people, like, this is like a ratio that I try to always consider when I'm forming a meal, is when I have these denser, starchier carbs, to also make sure I have just a little bit of like higher fructose sources, because can't that help blunt a higher blood sugar spike?
Yes, yeah, because fructose is going to go directly to the liver, and the liver is going to can turn it into glycogen, and then, like we talked about, glycogen can be turned into glucose. So doing just a little bit of like preserves on your toast, or having like a little OJ with your potatoes and meat or whatever it might be, can actually help you use the glucose in that meal better and make it more likely to go to the liver rather than into the fat cells.
Very cool. Yeah. I have heard that, like, I think it was actually a conversation between Jess and Libby, that sometimes including a starch before bed can also help improve sleep as well.
Yeah. I've had some people that need to, like, that are really poor sleepers, like we had talked about. Just, it can be really a very difficult challenge to get the liver to store enough glycogen at first. Like, some people, that is a huge challenge that takes months, if not years, to overcome. I've seen people take like up to 8 months, and they're like, I'm finally sleeping through the night. And a lot of times it's because they implemented a starch, a slow digesting starch before bed. So a lot of people have told me oatmeal specifically helps them sleep through the night. And so I like to bring that up a lot. And that's not even me finding that out. It's a lot of my followers who are just taking the information that I share and then kind of experimenting themselves. But a lot of them do sprouted oats before bed, and it's specifically whole oats, not the quick oats. And they're digesting slowly and keeping their liver fueled all night long.
Interesting. So again, experiments, because everyone is going to be different. We all come from different stages. We're all at different levels of like liver depletion and liver health.
Yeah. And then depending on what you're going through, like with you guys, you know, your liver has that extra burden. And so you're trying to kind of navigate that as well, because the liver is just, you know, continuously being depleted.
Yeah. So I don't have any more questions, do you?
No.
Okay.
That was a great conversation.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of applicable information people can take from this, I hope. Just with the overall reminder that healing takes time, and that even if you implement something like the oats or more starch, give it a solid amount of time before you decide that it's not working for you.
But healing, so it takes time, but it also takes dedication, and it takes patience.
Perseverance.
Yeah, and that's why like letting go can sometimes be helpful, because if you're like trying to control it so desperately, it could just make you really tired.
Yeah. Well, okay. So as like a final thing for somebody to look into, then what are some ways to let go? Like, what are there any therapies you recommend? Is there anything to do during the day that you would say has been really helpful in your own healing journey to feel yourself like open up that pathway for your body to heal?
Yeah, I definitely think, especially for like type A individuals, I know I am, I know you guys are like really high achievers as well. I think a lot of us in this space are. That's why we've gotten to where we're at. I think it's really important to be in your body. So, or at least take some time every day to get back in your body, because I know I have a tendency to separate myself from my body. So I'm not really checking in with my breathing. I'm not checking in with like where there's tension in my body. And I just maybe feel agitated, or I feel sad, or I feel overwhelmed, or, you know, I'm having these feelings, but I don't know where they're coming from. And I don't necessarily acknowledge them or allow myself to feel them. Instead, I just distract myself from them. And so there are a lot of therapies that can help. I think like doing myofascial work is so important. And that can just look as simple as just like sitting with your body for, 10 minutes and just feeling like where you're tense, where you're tight. Like, is it your jaw? Is it your upper traps? Is it your shoulder or your lower back? And just taking some time to breathe, get back into your body, maybe close your eyes so you can feel, and then maybe doing some trigger pointing if you have time, or some stretching to just kind of like allow some like energy back into those areas, because your body's tensing and tightening up for some reason. Your body's trying to protect those areas. And then letting yourself feel whatever emotions you're feeling. So if you're overwhelmed, or you're scared, or you're fearful, acknowledging those emotions and just saying like, it's okay to feel this way. Some people like to journal that out. Some people like to just talk to themselves. I've had people tell me they like to just go on walks and talk to themselves, but it's important to talk it out and allow those emotions out. Because if they're not out, they're in, and they're going to be stagnant. And healing can be really hard. So like breathing, doing some type of muscle work, and then just allowing those emotions out. Some people really like the emotional freedom technique. I found a lot of help from tapping. Some people really like neuro-linguistic feedback. or programming, that can be really helpful. Some people like EMDR, which is a little bit more of an in-depth type therapy. So there are a lot of modalities, but I think like the three kind of foundations to focus on is make sure you're breathing and in your body, make sure you're working out your muscle, because a lot of times that's where a lot of trauma, emotion, and toxins are going to be stored. And then, make sure you're allowing like some type of emotional release, whatever that might be, because emotions that stagnate are going to be not so great.
Sarah reminded me yesterday that it's okay to cry. So I just like bawled in the car for like probably an hour. And honestly, I felt really good afterwards.
I feel so good. I sometimes just say like, if you're not good at like acknowledging your emotions, just like do something that does make you. So like some people that aren't good at acknowledging their emotions will like watch a movie that's not even that sad and just like cry their eyes out. I'm like, just watch sad movies or do something that allows that outlet like once a week.
And to like circle this point back to like our whole topic today, like that is negatively going to impact your body's ability to use carbohydrates, being in a constant high cortisol, stressed out state.
Yeah.
So just keep
it. Yeah, and you often feel those emotions in your body, like your rib cage is tight, or you feel like a pit in your stomach, and like, how can we say that's not affecting us physically? It totally is.
All right, Jess, where can people find you? What projects and courses do you have to help people along their healing journey?
Yeah, so best place to find me is on my Instagram, Jess Ash Wellness. I also have a YouTube channel by the same name. If you liked what we talked about today, I actually have a blood sugar training that's free. It's called Creating Balance on my website, jesscashwellness.com. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about blood sugar stability and like the ins and outs of that, they can also find me there. But yeah, all across all channels, Jess Ash Wellness. And then I do have an online course called Fully Nourished that really helps, like it's really the foundations of pro-metabolic eating and coming from a place of being completely burnt out, having your hormones imbalanced, and kind of working through implementing everything slowly and getting to this place of like sustainable living while supporting your metabolism.
Yep, we've been through Fully Nourished and it's excellent. So definitely recommend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for hopping on the channel. I know you're super busy, so we appreciate the time you took out of your day today. I enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully you guys can take some points out. So
thanks for having me, guys.
All right, guys, I certainly took a lot out of that conversation. We took some notes for some things that we may tweak in our own nutrition strategy and lifestyle strategies to help us improve our blood sugar regulation and ultimately improve our sleep, given this current mold and biotoxin exposure that we've had recently. So we forgot to make Jess do it, but until our next video or podcast, behave like an angel.